Some of the most acclaimed and well-known monster movies of all time include such classics as Jaws, King Kong, and Jurassic Park. But another film that is often lumped in with those films, particularly in recent years, is the 1990 film Tremors. That, although was not very successful upon its initial release, was able to find an audience on home video and was successful enough to launch its own series of sequels that, for the most part, are surprisingly good. Greetings all you movie junkies and entertainment lovers, and welcome to another retrospective video. Today we're going to be talking about the Tremors franchise. The original Tremors follows down on their luck handyman Val and Earl, played by Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward, who have been working in the small town of Perfection, Nevada. One day they decide to leave for the nearest town of Bixby in hopes of better opportunities, but they soon discover that they left one day too late as they discover multiple dead bodies, who appear to have been killed by a mysterious underground creature. Along the way they meet Rhonda, a graduate student conducting seismology tests nearby, and discover that the creature is that of a large worm with 3 tentacled tongues that later become known as graboids. They later return to town with Rhonda and discover that there are 3 other graboids in the area and attempt to protect themselves and the other residents from being eaten alive. The film was written by Brent Maddock and S.S. Wilson, who had previously written the Short Circuit films, and it was the feature film debut of director Ron Underwood, who would later go on to direct the Billy Crystal comedy classic City Slickers, and the incredibly underrated 1998 remake of Mighty Joe Young. There are several things that make Tremors stand out from most other horror and monster movies of the time. For one thing, it actually has likable and even memorable characters. In horror movies, it's pretty much guaranteed that the lower the budget, the more disposables the characters will likely be. Tremors, however, takes the first 10 minutes just getting to know the characters and setting, with there being absolutely no dialogue or exposition to even set up the monsters. In fact, they never actually explain where the graboids came from. It's hinted that perhaps the construction work nearby could be what caused them to awaken, but it's never explicitly stated where they came from or how old they are. Which in a weird way is kind of brilliant, as it makes them feel more real and believable instead of making up a very typical science fiction plot where they turn out to be aliens or something. It was a smart decision considering the heart of the movie is not the monsters but rather how our characters are going to get out of this situation. This is something that other films with more poorly written characters simply couldn't get away with. It seems that the film overall takes a lot of influence from Jaws, which is very apparent when you compare the posters for each side by side. The big difference of course being that Jaws preyed on people's fears of a real animal, whilst Tremors' creatures are not real but treats them as such. That combined with the great characters, special effects, and execution make for what I would consider to be one of the all-time great monster movies, that stands out as being far better and more original than most other films of its kind, even to this day. But when you make something that is truly original, it can also be what hinders it from the initial success, especially if it isn't marketed well, as most audiences would rather see something more familiar than take a chance on something more unfamiliar. When the film was originally released in January of 1990, despite being mostly praised by critics, it made little to no impact, making only $16 million domestic on a roughly $10 million budget. However, unlike a lot of other cult classics, Tremors did not take very long to start finding its audience, as it became a massive hit when it was released on home video later that year. And by 1993, the film had gained enough traction to make Universal put a sequel into development, originally set to be filmed in Australia with a $17 million budget, and with Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward both returning. However, Bacon later turned it down to do Apollo 13 instead, which was probably the right career move anyway. With Kevin Bacon no longer attached to the project, combined with the fact that the first film wasn't that successful to begin with, Universal began to lose faith in the film and the budget gradually went down from $17 million to just $4 million, and the filming location switched from Australia to southern Mexico. The now titled Tremors 2 Aftershocks is set a few years after the first film, with Earl now living alone on his own ostrich ranch. He is approached by Carlos Ortega, who informs him of graboids killing his workers at his personal oil field in Mexico, and hires him to hunt them. Although Earl initially turns down the offer, Ortega's driver Grady tells Earl that Ortega will pay him $50,000 for each graboid that is killed, and possibly more if he catches one alive. Earl ultimately accepts and also enlists the help of Doomsday Prepper Burt Gummer, once again played by Michael Gross, who was a more minor character living in a compound just out of town in the first film. However, things don't quite go as planned, as the graboids have now evolved into bipedal heat seekers who later become known as shriekers, and that they can replicate themselves at an alarming rate if they eat enough food. This gives Tremors 2 more of an original feel whilst keeping the same overall tone of the first film, leading to an overall very faithful and enjoyable follow-up that really stands on its own. Brent Maddock and S.S. Wilson returned to write the script, with Wilson now taking on the reins as director, a role he agreed to do for free just to get the film made. While the film was shot in 1994, it wouldn't get released until 2 years later in April of 1996, in addition to not getting a proper theatrical release, instead going straight to home video. Then, a few years later in 2000, a third film was greenlit titled Tremors 3 Back to Perfection, this time with the intent of going direct to video. For most other franchises that go the direct-to-video route, they often tend to get lower and lower in quality, as the main goal most of the time is to just milk the franchise for all it's worth until it isn't even profitable anymore. But the Tremors franchise is one of the few exceptions where this isn't necessarily the case, as Tremors 3 is another solid and faithful follow-up, most likely because once again we have the original writers returning. Michael Gross once again returns as Burt Gummer, essentially taking over as the new main character of the franchise. And they once again evolve the graboids, this time going from shriekers to fire-propelled wing creatures who later become known as ass blasters. I can appreciate that the writers kept trying to reinvent the franchise of each installment even after it became direct-to-video. Then 2 years later, a TV series that picks up right where Tremors 3 left off premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel in 2003. That unfortunately was cancelled after only one season consisting of 13 episodes. The series doesn't really do much to push the franchise forward, mostly only dealing with stories about bad real estate developers and government experiments gone wrong. But it is an enjoyable enough watch, especially if you're a fan of the franchise. Then the following year, a prequel film set in the Old West titled Tremors 4 The Legend Begins was released. Follows Burt's ancestor Hiram Gummer, who essentially is the exact opposite of Burt, not wanting to have anything to do with weapons, but he of course eventually changes his tune. And it is notable in that it was the last entry from the original writers. For the most part, it's just a remake of the first film set in the Old West, not really adding anything we haven't seen before, but if you're a fan of the franchise and like westerns, then there's still fun to be had with this entry. Then, 11 years later, the franchise was rebooted with Tremors 5 Bloodlines, with Michael Gross once again returning and being joined by his estranged son Travis, played by Jamie Kennedy. The film was successful enough to receive 2 follow-ups, Tremors A Cold Day in Hell in 2018 and Tremors Shrieker Island in 2020. And with Shrieker Island actually working quite well as a possible ending to the overall franchise. So if you like the first 3 sequels, then chances are you will have fun with these entries as well. Just don't expect them to reinvent the franchise the way the first 2 did. It was also during this time that it was reported and later made official that Kevin Bacon would return to the franchise for the first time since the original film, for a new TV series that was picked up by the Sci-Fi Channel in 2017. However, after filming the pilot in 2017, it was officially announced in 2018 that Sci-Fi had cancelled the project. A trailer for the series with footage from the pilot was released online, which can still be seen to this day. As a fan of the franchise, I was very disappointed to hear that the series would not be moving forward. However, based on what we see in the trailer, it did seem to have a few small red flags. For one thing, it would appear that the series would have ignored every other entry in the franchise after the first film, which to be fair is something that a lot of other long-time franchises have done in recent years. For another thing, the very quick shot of a graboid we do see in the trailer doesn't really resemble or look like the ones from the first movie nor the rest of the franchise. Again, to be fair, this was likely unfinished effects. Perhaps the most concerning thing to me was one line from Kevin Bacon himself, where he says, "They don't strategize, they just kill." When the rest of the franchise, including the original, made it very clear that the graboids do strategize and are actually pretty smart creatures that learn to adapt very quickly. So as great as it would have been to see Kevin Bacon return to the role, part of me thinks we may have actually dodged a bullet in this case. And perhaps Sci-Fi realized this, which could be why they pulled the plug. Nonetheless, Kevin Bacon has still shown interest in returning even after this particular version was cancelled. So who knows what the future could hold. Overall, the Tremors franchise is surprisingly consistent, and personally I would say there isn't a truly bad entry in the entire series. But if one thing's for sure, it's that the original film is by far the best that the series has to offer, and definitely deserves its status as one of the greatest monster movies of all time. Thanks for watching this retrospective. Be sure to subscribe for more videos, and until next time, be sure to consume as much entertainment as humanly possible, and I will see you in the next video.